Okay, everybody, this is chapter 15, blood vessels and blood circulation. And I am going to go over what things you need to know for this chapter. Let's see here. Sorry about that. Okay. When we look at blood vessels themselves, we will be looking at the different types, the circuits, as well as the structure. I will go over some of the systemic arteries and the branches. You will not be responsible for knowing most of the veins and their branches. I will look at some of the circulation physiology, but most of this I feel pretty confident that you would have received it in your EMT or paramedic course or in your nursing courses. So I will be omitting a lot of that. Some of the key terms, and we will be differentiating between the 5 types of blood vessels and their structure and function, as well as comparing the pulmonary and the systemic circuits for location and function as well. You will be responsible for the 4 sections of the aorta and tracing the pathway of blood through the main arteries of the upper limbs and defining an anastomosis. The systemic veins, basically, I'm not going to hold you responsible for these. And circulation, we will look at the exchange of the different nutrients and gases in the capillary wall, as well as the factors that affect and regulate blood flow and pulse, and what things affect pulse rate. Blood pressure, I'm going to go over that a little bit, as well as some of the baroreceptors, their role in blood pressure and how it is measured. Okay, so when we look at the different types of blood vessels and the 5 types and their structure and function, and comparing the 2 different circuits, the pulmonary and the systemic, and let's just kind of look at that. So there are a few different types of blood vessels that circulate the blood through your body. First, you have your arteries, and you should remember that the arteries carry blood away from the heart, and that the arteries, as they move further and further away towards the arterioles, that they become smaller. The veins, on the other hand, carry blood to the heart. And I don't want you to get confused thinking that veins have unoxygenated blood and arteries have oxygenated blood. That's the norm, but not always. The norm is that arteries carry blood away and the veins carry blood to the heart. The veins do get smaller the further away that they get from the heart, and smaller the further away that they do move from the heart. Capillaries are the link between the arterioles and the venules, and that's where most of the exchange of oxygen and the gases between the blood and the tissues on the other side do occur. Okay, so if we look at the cardiac, the cardiovascular system, we notice that in blue that is, sorry about that, that if you look at the blue, that is unoxygenated blood, and that is being returned from the body through the systemic veins to the right atrium. Again, that does not have any oxygen in it, so that blood, in order to get circulated and sent back out to the system, has to pick up some oxygen. And the only way that that's going to occur is if it leaves through the pulmonary circuit by way of the right ventricle through the pulmonary arteries, which are carrying it away to the lungs. And the exchange actually occurs in the pulmonary capillaries, where you get the oxygen being picked up and the carbon dioxide waste being exchanged and deposited back into the lungs. And then you have the oxygenated blood then is going to return to the heart by means of the pulmonary veins to the left atrium, moving to the left ventricle, and then out through the systemic arteries out to the entire body. Once the exchange of the oxygenated blood and the waste of the carbon dioxide occurs in that tissue through the capillary beds, that spent blood is going to need to be replenished with oxygen, and it needs to be moved from the capillary beds of our system and moved back to the heart by means of the systemic veins, and they go back to the right atrium. So which arteries contain oxygen poor blood? That would be the pulmonary arteries, right? Because this is the blood that's returning from the system, which is deoxygenated, and so it needs to go out to the lungs to get the oxygen. And then which veins contain the oxygen-rich blood? And those would be the pulmonary veins. Okay, they picked up that oxygen, and they're going to get returned back to the left atrium, to the left ventricle, to get pumped out to the entire body to deliver the oxygen to the tissues of our system. So now, when we look at the arteries and the veins and a comparison of those, you will note that the blood vessels themselves are made up of 3 layers, and those being the elastic layer, well, the inner tunic, which is known as the endothelium. The tunics are the layers. So we have tunics or coatings both in the arteries and in the veins. But if you can do a comparison between the artery and the vein, you will note that this middle tunic layer, which is made up of smooth muscle, which is involuntary, is much thinner in the vein as compared to that in the artery. And then we have the outer tunic, which is made up of connective tissue, and that is pretty much the same between the arteries and the veins. And if we look at how blood flows, it's going to go from the arteries, from our heart, to the arterioles, to the capillaries, to the venules, to the veins, and then back to the heart again. The inner tunic, or the middle tunic of the arteries, is much more capable of carrying out vasodilation and vasoconstriction. So that smooth muscle has to be thicker in the arteries than in the veins. If you do look at one of the other differences between the arteries and the veins are carrying blood back to the heart. So it has to be a one-way flow. And what happens is we have these valves that are going to block and close off. So this is going to prevent backflow of blood through the veins. It is going to go one way back to the heart. So that's what is controlling the blood flow, or the valves in the veins. So if we look at blood vessels, there are two different circuits. There's the pulmonary circuit, which we've already kind of gone over, and the systemic circuit. The pulmonary circuit consists of this pulmonary trunk and its branches. So we have the pulmonary artery, and that's going to branch, and it's going to branch into our lungs themselves, and then it's going to form capillaries in our lungs, where we have the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And then we have the return of that oxygenated blood by means of the pulmonary veins back to back to the heart. And if you go back and you look, that those pulmonary veins are carrying blood back to the left atrium, then to the left ventricle, and out to the system. That is oxygenated blood. Okay. The systemic circuit consists of the major artery that's coming off of the heart, which is known as the aorta. And then it consists of systemic arteries. Primarily, the aorta is the largest. Then you're going to have some exchange of the oxygen and the nutrients into the tissues via the systemic capillaries, and then the return of the blood that is deoxygenated through the systemic veins. And again, the systemic veins are returning the blood to the right atrium, which has no oxygen. It's deoxygenated blood, so it has to go out through the right ventricle, through the pulmonary arteries, back to the lungs to pick up some of that oxygen. Okay, so when we look at the structure, you don't need to know the structure of each particular blood vessel itself. The only part that's really of importance is that the arteries have that smooth muscle layer that's involuntary, and we don't have to control, and we don't have any control over it. It can either constrict or dilate to make our vessels bigger or smaller, and it regulates both the blood vessels, the blood pressure rather, or to increase blood flow to an area. And that middle layer is really important in the arteries. The capillaries, on the other hand, have only one layer, and that's where most of the exchange of the oxygen and the nutrients occurs, with those outlying tissues that are surrounding the capillaries. Veins have that thin muscle layer, but as compared to the arteries, it's much thinner. So that middle tunic is much thinner in the veins. The muscle doesn't have to do a lot of constriction and dilation in the veins like it does in the arteries. So I went through this vessel structure a few minutes ago, so I'm going to skip over this. But if you look at the cross section between the artery and the vein, you clearly can see that the artery is much thicker, and that the middle tunic of smooth muscle is thicker in the artery as compared to the vein. So again, the 5 different types of blood vessels, those are arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. And then the 2 different blood circuits are the systemic and the pulmonary. And the pulmonary is going to deliver blood to the lungs, where you get some exchange of the carbon dioxide, that's being eliminated, and oxygen is being replenished in the blood. And then they carry that blood to the systemic circuit, and then the systemic circuit is going to carry that blood to the rest of the body, where it's going to pick up some of the waste materials and deliver some of that oxygen, and then the types of tissues that make up that middle tunic or smooth muscle, and it's under involuntary control. And then how many cell layers make up a capillary? That's just one layer thick, and it's made up of simple squamous epithelium. So it forms much of the surface of the blood, of the capillary. Okay, systemic arteries, we'll look at a little bit of this in terms of the sections and tracing the blood through the main arteries of the upper limbs I'll do, and then I'll define an anastomosis. So the aorta, again, is the largest artery. It does receive blood from the left ventricle, and it branches out to all of the organs. The aorta is broken down into four parts: the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, the thoracic aorta, and then the abdominal aorta. The branching of the ascending aorta and the aortic arch, the ascending aorta is coming up out of the heart, and it is going to branch off into the left and right coronary arteries, which are going to supply blood to the heart itself, to the myocardium. And and then we have the aortic arch, which is branching differently on the right and the left side. On the right side, the aortic arch branches into the brachiocephalic artery, the right subclavian, and the right common carotid. On the left side, the aortic arch just branches into the left common carotid and the left subclavian. And then the descending aorta branches through the chest wall, the esophagus, and then out into the lungs through the bronchi. And then we have these intercostal arteries that are moving out through the trunk of our body. The abdominal aorta, you're not responsible for this, but just to kind of give you some insight, it supplies most of the intestinal areas. The left gastric artery, the splenic artery, which serves the spleen, the hepatic artery that is serving the liver, and then you have the intestinal arteries, the superior and the inferior mesenteric arteries. And I'm not going to go through these, but these go down into your legs. So here it is here. The main portion that you should really understand, you have the aortic arch, and that is branching on the left side into two branches, the left subclavian and the left common carotid. Left subclavian and the left common carotid. On the right side, you have the main one coming off of that aortic arch, which is the brachiocephalic, which then branches into the right subclavian, which goes out under your clavicle, and then the right common carotid, which serves our head and neck. So it's over here. So the brachiocephalic is going to branch into the right subclavian, which goes out to our shoulder, and then the right common carotid, which goes up into the head and the neck. That's the part that I think is most important. And we only have one brachiocephalic artery on the right side. Again, I'm not asking you to know the iliac arteries and their subdivisions, which go down through our extremities. Okay, then so these are the principal systemic arteries. I do want you to know these here, the aortic with the aortic arch, which branches into the brachiocephalic, then to the subclavian and to the carotid, and then on the left side to the common carotid and to the subclavian on this side. Here are some of the arteries that serve our head and neck and go up into the brain. And now, an anastomosis, you might run into this in the future, but basically, what you need to know about an anastomosis is just a communication between two vessels where they come together, and an arterial anastomosis is going to reach all of the organs that are vital, and there are several different anastomoses that exist. The cerebral arterial one, which is the circle of Willis, which serves our brain, and then we have some of these others. And I'm not holding you responsible for those, but you should know at least what it is. Okay, and the aorta, the 3 branches, I do think that you need to know that, and all of these. So what are the subdivisions of the aorta? Those consist of the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, the thoracic aorta, and the abdominal aorta. And then the 3 branches of the aortic arch, we have gone over that: the brachiocephalic, the right common carotid, the left common carotid, and then the subclavian, both right and left, and then and anastomosis. What areas are supplied by the brachiocephalic? And that would be the head and the neck area. Okay, systemic veins, I'm not asking you to be responsible for these, neither the superficial nor the deep. You should know that the major veins that are returning blood to the heart are the superior vena cava, which drains the head and the neck and the upper extremities, and then the inferior vena cava, which serves the right and left veins, and everything from the lower extremities as well as our organs. The azygos vein, which is found in the chest wall. So these are the only ones that I think are most important. The rest, I'm not holding you responsible for, but you can see that blood is going back to the heart to get re-oxygenated and then pumped back out. So again, how many brachiocephalic veins are there? And if you look for the brachiocephalic veins, there is only one. The brachial artery is the one that we take our blood pressure with. So if you look at that, well, there's brachial vein, but it's the artery. I'm not asking you to be responsible for the venous sinuses, nor the veins of the head and the neck, not for the hepatic portal system. Okay. But if we look at the exchange of substances through our circulatory system, the capillary bed is where most of that exchange occurs, and diffusion is the main process by which those substances move between the cells and the capillary bed. There's an additional force that's going to move those materials from the blood into the tissue, and that's by blood pressure. And then also we have osmotic pressure, and that's maintained by the plasma proteins. And if you remember, osmosis has a definition based upon the number of particles that are present in the fluid, in the water. So the greater the concentration of the proteins, then that's going to mean that you need more water to come in, or more plasma, and so that is going to maintain that fluid exchange. However, the proteins themselves are too large to move through. But that osmotic pressure is primarily maintained by those plasma proteins, but the proteins themselves are too large to go through the capillary walls. So you have this constant exchange of fluids, but not of the substances. So as the blood's going to enter the capillary bed, there's a force on its fluid, and if it's greater than whatever the osmotic pressure is, then the water and the dissolved materials will move out into the capillaries and into the interstitial fluid that is within the tissues themselves. So you have some water loss, and that lowers the blood pressure. And so as the blood flows through the capillaries, you have a decrease in that blood pressure. And so, you know, all of this is this exchange is causing a difference in the pressure itself. So it's really, really slow, but the capillaries are allowing for this exchange of some of the fluid, okay, and it makes it such that some of that water gets left behind in the interstitial tissues, and I hope that makes sense for this portion regarding the blood pressure and osmotic pressure. So here we have the main process for capillary exchange, again, is by diffusion. However, we do have some osmotic pressure as well as some blood pressure that is helping in that exchange. And if you notice, blood is moving through from the venule to the arterioles, and the blood pressure is higher. The further that we move along, that blood pressure is decreasing, and then the osmotic pressure is due to the fact of the proteins, like the albumin and the other formed elements that are within the capillary itself, and the exchange of the water to the tissues. But if you note here, this is a capillary, and you have the capillaries are able to move oxygen and carbon dioxide out, and carbon dioxide in, okay, oxygen out to the tissues themselves, spent carbon dioxide in, but none of these larger components can move through that capillary wall. Some of that fluid that is moving as a result of the difference in the osmotic level due to the number and kind of elements that are found within the capillary as compared to the tissues on the outside will determine how much fluid is leaving or entering. Remember, water wants to flow to the hypertonic side. So, and then what picks that up is the lymphatic vessels. Okay. What's going to direct some of that circulation is the medulla oblongata, and it will determine the dilation of the blood vessels as well as the constriction of those blood vessels. Some of the other things that are responsible for returning blood back to the heart, if you remember, the veins have these valves in them, and the skeletal muscles are going to force open those veins, and the valves will remain open for the blood to flow in a one-way direction back towards the heart. So here it is here. So you're not going to get the contraction with the valves. Once they close, the blood can't flow back. It can only flow one way back to the heart. Okay. Some of the things that are influencing our pulse is the size of an individual. So, you know, small people have a faster pulse than larger people. It's usually slightly faster in women than in men. How much activity muscular activity will determine our pulse rate. During sleep, it slows down. Exercise, people that are in good condition, their pulse rate doesn't usually go up rapidly as it does in an individual that is less active. You know, emotions can increase our pulse rate, as well as heat or infection, and some secretions from our thyroid gland as well can cause our pulse rate to go up. Okay, baroreceptors, I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and I'll have an animation that describes that as well. We have a method by which, I'm trying to find it here, okay. We have a method by which we have a feedback loop for our large arteries to know when to dilate and when to constrict. And trying to find, it's here it is, okay. So we get a response that says that we have a hemorrhage, and so we have reduced blood flow. Okay, so that means that the carotid artery is going to receive a signal that the blood vessel itself is leaking. And when that happens, it's going to, because there are these baroreceptors, which are little nerve endings on that artery, and it's going to send the signal back to the brain, which is going to tell the blood vessels to constrict. This is being controlled through our sympathetic nervous system, part of our autonomic nervous system. And then we have vasoconstriction that occurs, and it's going to increase those signals to the heart to pump more, so it's going to increase our blood pressure, and that's equal to the increased resistance, which is the stroke volume or the output. If you remember, we have two things that are affecting our blood or our cardiac output, is the heart rate and our stroke volume. So the blood that's pumped out of each ventricle in 1 minute is equal to the cardiac output. That's the heart rate multiplied by the stroke volume, which is the volume of blood that's ejected from the ventricles on each beat. And the sympathetic nervous system can stimulate a more forceful heart contraction to increase that blood flow. Okay. So pretty much that's all that I'm going to cover for Chapter 15. I'm not going to go into some of these other disorders, because I think that you probably have had that in your nursing class or in EMT or paramedic. There is an aneurysm, which is a bulging, a weakened blood vessel, and it can burst, which can cause an aneurysm, which, and then you can have an embolism, which is a clot, and if the clot is then moving, you have a thrombosis, varicose veins, some of the other things. And that's it for this chapter, and I hope that everybody is enjoying the course, and I'll see you with Chapter 18. Thanks. Bye.